There are nights when everything falls apart, when the scoreboard becomes a nightmare, when every possession feels like drowning. In the history of professional basketball, some teams were built not to win, but to remind us how quickly dreams can collapse. These are the stories of the worst NBA teams ever assembled. Close your eyes, let the darkness settle, and listen to the whispers of basketball's most forgotten seasons. The year was 1972. Philadelphia was a city still mourning. Just 5 years earlier, the 76ers had been champions of the world. They had won 68 games in a single season, a record that stood as testament to greatness. Wilt Chamberlain dominated the paint. Hal Greer orchestrated from the backcourt. The city celebrated in the streets, but champions age and dynasties crumble. In July of 1968, something broke. Chamberlain wanted to return to the West Coast. There were whispers of conflict with ownership. His close friend and part owner, Isaac Richmond, had died 3 years prior. Richmond had been Chamberlain's lawyer, his confidant. According to reports, Richmond had offered Chamberlain an ownership stake in the team, a verbal promise that owner Irving Kozloff did not honor after Richmond's death. So Chamberlain was traded to the Los Angeles Lakers. The foundation cracked. By September of 1969, Chet Walker, a future Hall of Fame forward, was sent to the Chicago Bulls. Then Billy Cunningham, another Hall of Famer, jumped to the rival ABA after the 1971-72 season. A court ruling kept him there despite Philadelphia's legal fight. The Sixers tried to replace them with draft picks: Craig Raymond, Shaylor Halliman, Bud Ogden, Al Henry, Dana Lewis, Fred Boyd, names that would vanish like smoke. They passed on Nate Archibald. They passed on Calvin Murphy. The roster became a graveyard of missed opportunities.
By 1972, the Sixers needed a coach. The legendary Jack Ramsey had departed for Buffalo. They offered the job to Marquette's Al McGuire. He declined. They approached Adolph Rupp, the 70-year-old former Kentucky coach. He refused. In desperation, the organization did something unthinkable. They placed an advertisement in the Philadelphia Inquirer, a want ad, for a head coach in the National Basketball Association. A stockbroker named Jules Love responded, suggesting they hire Roy Rubin, a coach at Long Island University. Rubin was 46 years old. He had never coached a game in the NBA, but Philadelphia was desperate enough to offer him a 3-year contract worth $300,000, $100,000 per year, more than Wilt Chamberlain was earning with the Lakers. The players knew immediately.
At one practice, according to reports, Rubin suggested the team run full-court one-on-one games for 48 minutes straight. That would be all the preparation they needed. Dennis Autry, who briefly played for the Sixers, later said Rubin was a nice guy, but he really had a hard time coaching. Fred Carter, the team's leading scorer, compared the hire to bringing a teenager to run a major corporation. The season started on October 13, 1972. They lost, and lost, and lost again. 15 consecutive defeats to open the season. The losses weren't close. They weren't competitive. They were systematic destructions. Other teams used Philadelphia as a cure for their ailments. If you were struggling, you played the Sixers and got healthy. Carter called them a universal health spa. On November 11th in Houston, they finally won. Their record stood at 1-15. Roy Rubin was so excited he called sports writer Frank Dawson late that night, waking him from sleep. "Roy Rubin of the 76ers," he said. "We beat the Houston Rockets." He asked if Dawson had questions. Dawson hung up. The Sixers wouldn't win at home until December 30th. The roster was a collection of aging veterans and overwhelmed young players. Hal Greer, 36 years old, was the last remaining member of the championship team. Fred Carter averaged 20 points per game, but played on a team that couldn't defend, couldn't execute, couldn't win. Tom Van Arsdale contributed 17.7 points per game. John Block added 17.4. But nothing mattered when the system was broken. There were stories that became legend. John Q. Trapp, a troubled forward, once sat on the bench during the second half holding what he said was a Coke. A teammate warned another player, "You don't want that cup." It was bourbon and Coke. According to Charlie Rosen's book, Perfectly Awful, Trapp had called in a fake bomb threat as a Laker to avoid missing a team flight. In Detroit, during a timeout, Rubin tried to substitute Trapp out of the game. Trapp said no. When Rubin insisted, Trapp gestured to the crowd. One of his friends stood up and opened his coat, revealing a gun in a shoulder holster. Rubin let Trapp stay in the game. The team suspended Trapp for missing practices. The chaos was complete. By mid-February, their record stood at 4 wins and 58 losses, a .065 winning percentage. They were on pace to finish 5-77. Then, something strange happened. For 7 games, they played like a real team. They won 5 times, including victories over the 60-win Milwaukee Bucks and the eventual champion New York Knicks. Their record improved to 9-60. They had doubled their winning percentage. And then, it ended.
They lost their final 13 games of the season. On January 23, 1973, after a record of 4-47, Roy Rubin was fired. Kevin Lowry took over. When asked what it would take for the team to make the playoffs, Lowry answered, 3 airplane crashes. They finished 9-73. 73 losses. The worst full-season record in NBA history. 59 games behind the division-leading Boston Celtics. A .110 winning percentage. The players knew what they had become. Mel Counts, who played on that team, later said, "I wouldn't wish a full season like that on my worst enemy." Decades later, members of that team still notice when other teams threaten their record. "Oh yeah," said Jeff Halliburton, who played 31 games that season. "Believe me, it's noticed." The 9-73 still stands. 42 years later, no team has lost more games in an 82-game season. It remains the benchmark for failure, the standard by which all other disasters are measured. Philadelphia finished last that year, but in the darkness, there was a seed of hope. They would draft Doug Collins with the first pick. They would begin to rebuild. Within a few years, they would draft Julius Erving. They would become relevant again. But the 9-73 would never be forgotten. Those players carry it with them still. A season so bad, it became immortal. The lockout changed everything. In 2011, the NBA and the Players Union could not agree on a new collective bargaining agreement. For 161 days, the league shut down. Players couldn't access team facilities. Teams couldn't contact their players. The entire machinery of professional basketball ground to a halt. When the lockout finally ended, the season was shortened. 66 games instead of 82. Every team would be tested. But for one franchise, it would become a nightmare that made history. The Charlotte Bobcats entered the 2011-12 season with cautious optimism, then won 34 games the previous year. They had drafted Kemba Walker, the national champion point guard from Connecticut, with the 9th overall pick. They had selected Bismack Biyombo, a defensive project from the Congo, 7th overall. Michael Jordan, the greatest player in basketball history, was the majority owner. Surely things would improve. They did not.
The Bobcats started slowly. Injuries plagued the roster from the beginning. Corey Maggette, a veteran scorer, missed significant time. DJ Augustine battled various ailments throughout the year. The team had lost key players from the previous season. Tyson Chandler was gone. Gerald Wallace had been traded. The roster was thin, young, and unprepared for the compressed schedule. Coach Paul Silas tried everything. Different lineups, different rotations, different motivational tactics. Nothing worked. The Bobcats couldn't score. They averaged 87 points per game, dead last in the league. They shot 41.6% from the field, also last. They were bad at threes, bad at assists, bad at everything that creates offense. Defensively, they were only slightly better, allowing 100.8 points per game, 4th worst in the NBA. The losses accumulated like snow in a blizzard. From January 16th to February 15th, they lost 16 consecutive games. The arena grew quieter, fans stopped coming, the energy drained from the building like water from a broken pipe.
Gerald Henderson led the team in scoring with 15.1 points per game. Just 15.1. No player averaged more than 16. Kemba Walker, the rookie point guard, who had carried Connecticut to a national championship just months earlier, averaged 12.1 points and 4.4 assists. He was learning, but he was learning in hell. Biyombo provided defensive energy, averaging 5.8 rebounds and 1.3 blocks per game. But he was raw, unpolished, a project thrown into an impossible situation. Then came March 17, 2012. The Bobcats beat the Toronto Raptors. The score was 90-89. It was their 7th win of the season. In the locker room afterward, there was relief. Not celebration, just relief. They had won a game. It would be their last victory for a very long time. 23 consecutive losses followed. 23 games where hope died a little more each night. They lost to everyone. They were blown out repeatedly. 44 points to Portland, 33 to the Lakers. The margins weren't close. They were executions.
On April 26, 2012, they played their final game of the season. The New York Knicks came to Charlotte. Michael Jordan watched from his private box. The Bobcats tried to compete in the first half, trailing by only 2 at halftime. Then the Knicks pulled away in the third quarter. Amare Stoudemire scored 11 points in that period. The final score was 104-84. The Bobcats had finished 7-59. 7 wins, 59 losses. A .106 winning percentage. The worst winning percentage in NBA history. They had surpassed the 1972-73 Philadelphia 76ers. Those Sixers had gone 9-73 for a .110 winning percentage. But the Bobcats' .106 was lower. Mathematically, historically, permanently worse. Paul Silas stood at the podium after the final game. His contract was expiring, his future was uncertain. The season itself was a long haul for all of us. Upstairs and downstairs, he said. Being the worst team in the history of the game is not something you cherish. The players felt the weight too. Henderson, who scored 21 points in that final loss, spoke quietly. Going 7-59 like we did is not what we planned on doing, he said. This doesn't sit very well with me. These last 10 games, we've really tried to get after it, compete, and not get that record. It just didn't happen for us.
In the draft lottery, Charlotte had a 25% chance at the first overall pick. They finished second. Anthony Davis went to New Orleans, the former Charlotte franchise that had moved years earlier. The Bobcats selected Michael Kidd Gilchrist instead. He would be a solid defensive player, but never a star. The franchise limped forward. 2 years later, they rebranded as the Hornets, reclaiming their old name, trying to erase the Bobcats era from memory. But the 7-59 remains. It's in the record books forever. Michael Jordan, who went 72-10 with the Chicago Bulls in 1995-96, the best regular season in NBA history, now owned the worst season by winning percentage. The irony was not lost on anyone. The greatest player ever assembled the worst team ever. The .106 stands alone, a benchmark of failure so complete, so thorough, that even in a shortened season, it achieved a kind of terrible perfection. The altitude in Denver makes it hard to breathe, but in 1997, the Nuggets made it impossible to watch.
They had been competitive just a few years earlier. Dikembe Mutombo had anchored the defense, wagging his finger after blocked shots. The Nuggets had even pulled off one of the greatest playoff upsets in history, becoming the first 8th seed to beat a 1st seed when they defeated the Seattle Supersonics in 1994. But Mutombo was gone, traded to Atlanta. The roster was gutted. The franchise was in financial trouble. And they hired Bill Hanslick, a former player with 0 NBA head coaching experience, to lead them. The season began on October 31st, 1997. They lost.
And lost. And lost. 12 straight defeats to open the season. By the time they finally won on November 21st against the New Jersey Nets, they were already drowning. The win felt like a brief gasp of air before going under again. They kept losing, on and on. The losses stretched into days, then weeks. After 40 games, they had won only 2. 2 wins in 40 games. Their record was 2-38, a .050 winning percentage. They were on pace to win fewer than 5 games all season. 23 consecutive losses, tied with the 1995-1996 Vancouver Grizzlies for one of the longest losing streaks in NBA history. Opponents scored at will. The Nuggets had the worst defensive rating in the NBA. Their offensive rating was 28th out of 29 teams. They averaged 89 points per game. They allowed 100.8.
Johnny Newman, coming off the bench, led the team in scoring with 14.7 points per game. LaFonso Ellis averaged 14.3 points and 7.2 rebounds. Bobby Jackson, a rookie point guard, provided 11.6 points and 4.7 assists and made the all-rookie second team. But it didn't matter. Individual performances meant nothing when the team couldn't win. Danny Fortson, another rookie, averaged 10.2 points and 5.6 rebounds. Tony Batty, the 5th overall pick, contributed 8.4 points and 5.4 rebounds. Young players trying to learn the NBA game on a team that couldn't teach them anything except how to lose. Eric Williams, acquired from Boston in the offseason, suffered a devastating knee injury after just 4 games, out for the season. Dean Garrett tried to provide veteran presence, averaging 7.3 points and 7.9 rebounds. But veteran presence doesn't win games when the system is broken.
The attendance at McNichols Sports Arena dropped to 380,590 for the season, 28th out of 29 teams. The building felt empty. The energy was gone. Fans stopped believing. Bill Hanslick stood on the sideline watching his team get destroyed night after night. His face grew more haggard as the season progressed. He had been a beloved player in Denver, a scrappy guard known for his toughness. But coaching was different. This was different. The Nuggets finished 11-71. 11 wins, 71 losses. A .134 winning percentage, tied with the 1992-93 Dallas Mavericks for the 3rd fewest wins in an 82-game season. Hanslick was fired immediately after the season ended. He would never coach in the NBA again. The Nuggets had the 5th overall pick in the 1998 draft. They selected Rafe LaFrentz from Kansas. He would have a solid career, but never as a Nugget. They traded him on draft night to Dallas. Some analysts have argued that the 1997-98 Nuggets were actually worse than the legendary 9-73 76ers. Basketball enthusiast Kyle Wright, in his 2007 study, The NBA from Top to Bottom, pointed out that the Nuggets played a much tougher schedule. They faced the powerful Western Conference teams repeatedly. The Midwest Division in 1997 was brutal. Meanwhile, the 1972-73 Sixers had played in an Atlantic Division dominated by one team, Boston, which they faced only 7 times.
On paper, 11-71 looks better than 9-73. But context matters. The Nuggets might have been even worse. They couldn't defend. They couldn't score. They couldn't win at home. They won only 2 games on the road all season. 2 road wins in 41 tries. The franchise would struggle for years afterward. It would take them nearly a decade to become competitive again. The stain of 11-71 lingered like a curse. In Denver, where the air is thin and breathing is hard, that season made breathing impossible. Texas is supposed to be big, bold, confident. The Dallas Mavericks in 1992 were none of those things. They came into the season after winning just 22 games the year before. Coach Richie Adubato had Derek Harper, a talented point guard, as the centerpiece. They had traded Rolando Blackman to the Knicks for a first-round pick. They had drafted Jim Jackson, a star guard from Ohio State, with the 4th overall pick.
But Jackson refused to play. Contract dispute. He held out for months, missing training camp, missing the start of the season, watching from home while his team collapsed without him. The Mavericks started 1-3. Not terrible. Maybe they could survive. Then they lost 12 straight games between November and December. Then 15 consecutive losses between December and January. Then 8 straight between January and February. And then the nightmare within the nightmare, 19 consecutive losses between February and March. 19 games without a victory. 19 games where every hope died before halftime. 19 games where the opponent treated Dallas like a scrimmage. By the time they reached Game 61 of the season, their record was 4-57. 4 wins, 57 losses. They were threatening to break the 9-73 record. They were on pace to finish 3-79. 3 wins, unimaginable. Derek Harper, the team's best player, did what he could. He averaged 18.2 points and 5.4 assists per game. He made 101 three-pointers. But with Harper on the court, the Mavericks were 8-54. Without him, they were 3-17. His presence barely mattered.
Sean Rooks, a second-round pick, showed promise, averaging 13.5 points and 7.4 rebounds. But his weight became an issue. He gained weight throughout the season, hurting his long-term prospects. Terry Davis contributed 12.7 points and 9.3 rebounds per game. Doug Smith, a second-year forward, added 10.4 points and 5.4 rebounds. But individual stats meant nothing. The team couldn't win. They fired Richie Adebayo after a 2-27 start. Gar Hurd took over. Under Hurd, they went 9-44. Marginally better, still catastrophic. Fat Lever, a veteran guard, missed the entire season with a knee injury. They had hoped he would provide leadership. Instead, his locker sat empty. Roy Tarpley, a troubled power forward they hoped to bring back, didn't play a single game either. His drug addiction was too severe. The NBA eventually banned him for life.
Jim Jackson finally signed in early March. He played the final 28 games, averaging 16.3 points per game. In those final 21 games with Jackson, the team won 7 times, including 2 straight to close the season. It gave them a sliver of dignity, a tiny reprieve. They finished 11-71. 11 wins, 71 losses, a .134 winning percentage, tied with the 1997-98 Denver Nuggets for the 3rd worst record in an 82-game season. But here's what makes the Mavericks season unique. They had the worst point differential in NBA history, negative 15.2 points per game. That's over 3 points worse than the 9-73 Sixers, over 5 points worse than the 2015-16 76ers, who won only 10 games. The Mavericks weren't just losing, they were getting obliterated. They lost to the Sacramento Kings by 58 points. 58! They lost by double digits 50 times. 50 times in 82 games, they were blown out. For NBA historian Kyle Wright, this was the key. The Mavericks weren't just the worst team relative to the league. They were the worst team relative to their competition. Worse than the 9-73 Sixers. Worse than anyone.
After the season, they fired Gar Hurd. They drafted Jamal Mashburn 4th overall in 1993. Mashburn averaged 19.2 points per game as a rookie. The Mavericks won only 13 games. They never had a season over 500 while Mashburn was on the team. The Dallas Cowboys won the Super Bowl that season. The entire city focused on football. The Mavericks played in near anonymity. Owner Donald Carter still came to games at Reunion Arena, a loyal Cowboy watching his team die slowly. But the fans didn't care, or they cared too much to watch. The 1992-93 season broke something in Dallas basketball. It would take years to repair. Mark Cuban would eventually buy the team. They would draft Dirk Nowitzki. They would win a championship in 2011. But the 11-71 remains. A scar, a reminder of how dark it can get. There's a building in Los Angeles where magic happens. But in 1986, if you were wearing the wrong uniform, that building was a tomb.
The Los Angeles Clippers have never won a championship. For decades, they were synonymous with failure. They played in the same city as the Lakers, the Showtime dynasty. Magic Johnson and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar winning titles, while the Clippers lost in obscurity. The 1986-87 season was the worst of them all. Donald Sterling had purchased the team in 1981. By 1986, his reputation was already forming. Cheap, controlling, uninterested in winning. The Clippers became known as the place where careers went to die. They had moved from San Diego to Los Angeles in 1984, sharing the city with the Lakers, but never the glory. They played at the Los Angeles Memorial Sports Arena, a building that felt outdated, cramped, wrong. Attendance was brutal. 316,140 for the entire season, last in the league. The roster was a mix of injured stars and journeymen. Derek Smith, a talented scorer, was hurt. Norm Nixon battled injuries. Marquise Johnson couldn't stay healthy. When your best players can't play, the foundation crumbles. Don Chaney coached the team. He tried to implement systems, strategies, rotations. None of it mattered. The Clippers couldn't score consistently. They averaged 104.5 points per game, 21st out of 23 teams. Their defensive rating was 23rd, dead last. They gave up 115.9 points per game.
Mike Woodson led the team in scoring. On February 2, 1987, he set a season high with 37 points in a road win against San Antonio. It was one of the few bright moments. Woodson also recorded a season-high 7 steals on November 11th in Portland. Individual achievements in a sea of loss. Michael Cage provided toughness inside, averaging 14.6 points and 12.8 rebounds per game. On December 12, 1986, he recorded 39 efficiency in a home loss to Portland. 21 points, 17 rebounds, 2 steals. On January 1, 1987, he grabbed 20 rebounds against Detroit. But they lost both games. Cage's effort was wasted. Darnell Valentine ran the point, dishing 15 assists on January 1st against San Antonio. The Clippers lost that game too. Everything turned to loss. The franchise was a joke. When the 1989 draft came, Danny Ferry was selected 2nd overall. He refused to sign with the Clippers. Refused. He went to play in Italy instead, for Messaggero Roma, just to avoid wearing a Clippers uniform. The franchise's reputation was so toxic that a top draft pick chose Europe over them. They finished 12-70.
12 wins, 70 losses, a .146 winning percentage, the worst in franchise history. The Lakers across the hall were winning championships. The Clippers were losing by 20, 30, 40 points. The curse felt real. It felt permanent. The Clippers would go on to miss the playoffs for 15 consecutive years. They would draft poorly. They would make terrible trades. They would waste talent. Blake Griffin, Chris Paul. They would finally get good players, good seasons, but never a championship. The 12-70 haunted the franchise. It was the baseline, the lowest point. Even when they improved, the memory remained. Donald Sterling would own the team for 33 years, a reign of dysfunction and disappointment. He was finally forced to sell in 2014 after racist comments were made public. Steve Ballmer bought the team for $2 billion and tried to change the culture. But the 12-70 season remains in the archives, a monument to failure, a season where everything that could go wrong did go wrong. In Los Angeles, a city of dreams, the Clippers learned what it meant to live in a nightmare. Sometimes a season is over before it begins.
The New Jersey Nets entered the 2009-10 season in transition. They had traded Vince Carter, their star, the previous year. The roster was thin. The ownership was preparing to move the team to Brooklyn. Everything felt temporary, unsettled, halfway gone. Lawrence Frank was the coach. He had been with the organization for years, a basketball lifer who understood the game. But understanding doesn't always translate to winning, especially when the roster is depleted. Devin Harris was supposed to be the centerpiece, a young point guard with speed and scoring ability. But he battled injuries all season, missing significant time. When your best player is hurt, the structure collapses. The season began on October 27, 2009. They lost. October 30th, lost again. November 3rd, lost. November 6th, lost.
On and on, loss after loss. The defeats accumulated like a disease spreading through the locker room. 1 became 5, 5 became 10, 10 became 15. On December 2nd, 2009, they played the Dallas Mavericks. They gave up 49 points in the second quarter alone. 49 points in one quarter, the most ever allowed at the time. The final score was 111-82, Mavericks by 29. The Nets were 0-18. 18 consecutive losses to start the season. The worst winless start in NBA history. Worse than any team had ever begun. Worse than seemed possible in the modern NBA. Lawrence Frank was fired after a 0-16 start. He had never won a game that season. He had tried everything, different lineups, different schemes. Nothing worked. When you have no talent, there is no strategy that saves you. Tom Barris took over on an interim basis. He went 0-2. Then Kiki Vandeweghe, the general manager, took over coaching duties. Vandeweghe had never coached before. He was learning on the job during a historic disaster. On December 4th, the Nets played the Charlotte Bobcats at home, the Izod Center in East Rutherford, New Jersey. The building was half empty. 13,103 fans on average that season, dead last in the league. Many nights it felt like a scrimmage.
But on December 4th, they won, 98-84 over Charlotte, their first victory. The players celebrated like they had won a championship. Relief flooded the locker room. It was just one win, but after 0-18, one felt like everything. Then, they kept losing. By the All-Star break, they had 4 wins. 4. At the halfway point of the season, 4 victories. Their record was 4-40. The math was horrifying. They were on pace to finish 8-74, even worse than the 9-73 Sixers. On February 6th, they lost to Detroit, falling to 4-46. They tied the record for the worst 50-game start in the history of major North American sports. Worse than baseball, worse than hockey, worse than anything. Brook Lopez was the bright spot. The second-year center from Stanford played all 82 games, the only net to do so. He averaged 18.8 points and 8.6 rebounds per game. He was learning, growing, trying to lead a team that couldn't be led.
Terrence Williams recorded the first triple-double of his career against Chicago. It was a milestone in the middle of a wasteland. Devin Harris missed 18 games with injuries. When he played, he averaged 16.9 points and 7.4 assists, but it wasn't enough. Nothing was enough. The Nets had 20 players suit up that season. They used everybody. At one point, the entire starting lineup except Brook Lopez was injured. They were forced to play with only the league minimum of 7 active players multiple times. It wasn't just bad luck. It was a systematic failure. Yi Jianlian played only 51 games, dealing with a sprained MCL, a sprained ankle, a lip laceration. Keon Dooling played 53 games, recovering from off-season hip surgery. Jarvis Hayes played 45 games with knee and calf injuries. The training staff worked harder than the players. The Nets finished 12-70, 12 wins, 70 losses, .146 winning percentage, tied with the 1986-87 Clippers for the 6th worst record in NBA history. They had the 3rd overall pick in the draft. They selected Derek Favors from Georgia Tech. He would become part of the trade that brought Deron Williams to New Jersey the following season. Williams would eventually leave for Dallas. Favors would be traded to Utah.
The ripples of the 12-70 season would affect the franchise for years.
The Nets moved to Brooklyn in 2012. They built a new arena, they tried to start fresh. But the 0-18 start remains in the record books, the worst beginning in history. Lawrence Frank, fired after 16 games of failure, never got to see his team win. In a different timeline, maybe he would have. Maybe the first win would have come under his watch. But in this timeline, he was gone before it happened. The 2009-10 Nets were more than just a bad team. They were a symbol of transition, a franchise in limbo, a roster built to fail while ownership planned for a different city, a different future. And in New Jersey, in that final season at the Izod Center, the Nets learned what it meant to start with nothing and end with almost nothing. There is a psychology to losing that winners never understand. Imagine walking into work every day knowing you will fail, knowing the scoreboard will humiliate you, knowing that no matter what you do, how hard you try, the result will be the same. Loss. Public. Recorded. Permanent.
That's what it means to play on the worst teams in NBA history. Fred Carter, who scored 20 points per game for the 9-73 Sixers, later described the experience as soul-crushing. When you know the coaching is less than what it could be, it's discouraging, he said. The players gave up on Roy Rubin. Rubin gave up on the players. And in between, they lost 73 times. Mel Counts, another member of that Sixers team, said years later, "I wouldn't wish a full season like that on my worst enemy." The weight of losing 89% of your games changes you. It seeps into your confidence, your identity, your sense of what's possible. For young players, it's especially damaging. Kemba Walker entered the NBA as a national champion, a clutch performer, a winner. In Charlotte, he averaged 12.1 points on a 7-59 team. His shooting percentage was low. His turnovers were high. The losing became a habit, a pattern he had to unlearn. Bobby Jackson made the all-rookie second team on an 11-71 Nuggets squad. But being recognized individually while losing constantly creates a disconnect. You're good enough to be noticed, but not good enough to win. Where does that leave you? Coaches suffer too. Roy Rubin's reputation never recovered. He coached 47 games with the Sixers and was fired. He never coached in the NBA again. Bill Hanslick, a beloved former player in Denver, coached the 11-71 Nuggets. He was fired immediately after the season, never given another chance. His entire coaching career defined by that single catastrophic year.
Lawrence Frank started 0-16 with the Nets before being fired. A coach who had once led New Jersey to the playoffs, who understood the game deeply, was humiliated on national television game after game. The 0-18 start wasn't entirely his fault. The roster was broken. But the record is forever attached to his name. Paul Silas, who won over 100 games as a player with 2 championship rings, coached the 7-59 Bobcats. He stood at press conferences trying to explain the unexplainable. How do you motivate players when losing has become the norm? How do you teach winning when you can't win? Silas was not retained after the season. His final NBA coaching record ended with that historic disaster attached. The fans suffer in a different way. They pay for tickets, hoping for entertainment, for competition, for something to believe in. Instead, they watch their team get destroyed. Attendance drops. The arena becomes a morgue. In Dallas during the 11-71 season, fans stopped coming. The energy in Reunion Arena died. The Mavericks played in front of empty seats, the silence amplifying every mistake. Charlotte averaged only 13,243 fans per game during the 7-59 season. The Bobcats arena, which could hold nearly 20,000, felt cavernous and empty. Fans who had supported the franchise through mediocrity couldn't stomach historic failure. But there were those who stayed, who kept coming back, who remained loyal even when loyalty seemed foolish. These fans carried the trauma differently. They wear the losing seasons like scars. They remember the pain. And when their team finally does win,
The joy is deeper because they survived the darkness. The front office personnel who built these terrible teams rarely escape unscathed. General managers get fired, scouts get blamed, draft picks become symbols of failure. The 1998 Nets took Yinka Dare in the first round in 1994. He averaged 2.1 points per game in his career. The Clippers drafted Michael Olowokandi first overall in 1998. He was never an all-star. These decisions haunt the people who made them. And then there are the players who used losing as fuel, who emerged from the wreckage stronger. Brook Lopez played every game on that 12-70 Nets team. Every single game. He could have quit, could have asked for a trade, could have faked injuries to preserve his body for a better situation. Instead, he showed up. He averaged 18.8 points and 8.6 rebounds on the worst team in the league. Years later, he became an NBA champion with the Milwaukee Bucks in 2021. Derek Harper played his heart out for an 11-71 Mavericks team, averaging 18.2 points per game. He never won a championship, but he played 17 seasons and made 5 All-Star teams. He refused to let one terrible season define him. Fred Carter, despite playing on the 9-73 Sixers, had already established himself as a quality NBA player. That season was an outlier in a solid career. He retired with dignity, his reputation intact, despite the record. But not everyone survives unscathed. Some players never recover. Their confidence is broken. Their bodies wear down from playing meaningless minutes on hopeless teams. Injuries pile up when losing makes you careless, when the season stretches on forever and every game feels like punishment. The psychological toll is real. Depression, anxiety, a sense of worthlessness. Professional athletes are trained to win. Their entire identity is built around competition and success. When that's stripped away, when losing becomes your reality every single night, it damages something fundamental. Some players have spoken about the darkness, the empty feeling after another loss, the dread before games, the embarrassment of seeing highlights of your team getting blown out on SportsCenter, the text messages from friends and family who don't know what to say anymore.
And then there's the legacy. Players on these teams carry that record forever. When Fred Carter's obituary is written, it will mention the 9-73 Sixers. When Kemba Walker's career is summarized, the 7-59 Bobcats will be there. It's inescapable. But some have learned to own it, to speak about it honestly, to acknowledge the pain and the lessons learned. You find out who you are when you're losing that much, one player said years later. You find out if you're really about basketball or just about winning. I learned I loved the game even when we couldn't win. That's the human cost, not just the losses, not just the statistics, but the way it changes people, the way it tests their character, their resilience, their love for the game. Some break, some survive, and the very few emerge stronger, carrying the scars but no longer defined by them. The worst teams in NBA history weren't just bad at basketball. They were experiments in human endurance, tests of how much losing a person can absorb before something inside them breaks, and the answer, it turns out, varies from person to person. The worst teams in NBA history didn't just lose games. They changed the league.
After the 1972-73 Sixers went 9-73, the NBA recognized something had broken. The league had expanded too quickly. From 9 teams in 1966 to 17 teams by 1970. The talent pool was diluted. Quality players were spread too thin. Bad teams were catastrophically bad. The solution came in 1985. The NBA introduced the draft lottery. Before that, teams simply tanked. They openly lost games on purpose to secure the first overall pick. The lottery introduced uncertainty. You could finish with the worst record and still not get the first pick. It wasn't perfect, but it reduced the incentive to deliberately lose.
But the lottery created its own problems. Teams still tanked, just with slightly more subtlety. The phrase tanking entered the basketball vocabulary. Fans debated whether it was ethical. General managers claimed they were rebuilding, developing young talent, playing for the future. But everyone knew the truth. They were losing on purpose. The 2011-12 Bobcats claimed they were trying to win. With a 7-59 record and the worst winning percentage in history, some questioned whether that was true. But Paul Silas insisted his players competed. "These guys gave me everything they had," he said after being let go. "They just weren't talented enough." The debate intensified with the Philadelphia 76ers of the mid-2010s. General manager Sam Hinkie openly embraced losing as a strategy. Trust the process became the motto. They went 18-64 in 2013-14, 17-65 in 2014-15, 10-72 in 2015-16.
3 consecutive years of historic losing, deliberately, strategically. They drafted Joel Embiid, who was injured. They drafted Ben Simmons, who sat out his entire first year. They accumulated assets, draft picks, cap space. They lost and lost and lost. Fans were divided. Some embraced the process. They wore shirts with the slogan. They celebrated losses as steps toward future greatness. Others felt betrayed. They had paid for tickets to watch a professional basketball team. Instead, they got a glorified tanking operation. The NBA eventually forced Hinkie out. They installed Jerry Colangelo to oversee operations. The league couldn't stomach that level of transparency about tanking. It was bad for business, bad for the product, bad for fans. But here's the thing. The process worked. By 2019, the 76ers were legitimate contenders. They made the playoffs. They won a playoff series. They came within 1 bounce of the Eastern Conference Finals. Joel Embiid became a superstar. Ben Simmons became an all-star. The losing had produced something. Not all rebuilds work. The Dallas Mavericks went 11-71 in 1992-93. They drafted Jamal Mashburn. Then they drafted Jim Jackson earlier. They drafted Jason Kidd in 94. 3 lottery picks in 3 years. But they never built a championship contender with those players. Kidd was traded. Mashburn was traded. Jackson was traded. The losing didn't lead anywhere.
The Charlotte Bobcats went 7-59 in 2011-12. They got the 2nd pick, selected Michael Kidd-Gilchrist, and remained mediocre for years. The losing didn't unlock future success, it was just losing. The Denver Nuggets went 11-71 in 97-98. They drafted Raef LaFrentz 5th overall and traded him immediately. They remained bad for years. No process, no plan, just chaos. The lesson? Losing by itself doesn't guarantee anything. You need the right leadership, the right scouting, the right player development, the right culture. And even then, you need luck. You need your draft picks to stay healthy. You need them to develop. You need them to want to stay. The worst teams in NBA history also reveal something about competitive balance. In a 30-team league, someone has to finish last. Someone has to win the fewest games. But should that team win only 7 games out of 66? Should they lose 73 times? Is that acceptable? The NBA has tried to address it. They changed the lottery odds in 2019. The 3 worst teams now have equal 14% chances at the first pick. It reduces the incentive to finish dead last. The worst team no longer has the best odds.
They've also implemented rules about resting healthy players. Teams can't just sit their best players to lose games. There are fines. There are investigations. The league wants competition, even from bad teams. But some teams are just bad. Not tanking, not strategic, just poorly constructed, poorly coached, poorly run. The 1986-87 Clippers weren't tanking, they were just terrible. Donald Sterling was a bad owner. The roster was injured. The culture was broken. They lost 70 games because they couldn't win. The human stories are what matter most. Brook Lopez playing every game on a 12-70 team. Fred Carter scoring 20 per game on a 9-73 disaster. Kemba Walker learning the NBA as a rookie on the worst team by winning percentage ever. These players didn't quit. They showed up. They competed. They lost and lost and lost, but they kept playing. That says something about character, about professionalism, about love for the game. And some cities remained loyal. Philadelphia fans stuck with the 76ers through the process. They understood the vision. They trusted it, even when it meant watching D-League players in NBA uniforms. When the team finally got good, the fans were there, loud and proud.
Dallas fans came back after 11-71. When Mark Cuban bought the team in 2000, attendance surged. When Dirk Nowitzki led them to a championship in 2011, the city celebrated like they'd been freed from a curse. The 11-71 was forgiven, if not forgotten. Charlotte fans welcomed the return of the Hornets name. They tried to erase the Bobcats era. They wanted to forget 7-59. But the record remains. The worst teams in NBA history are more than statistics. They're cautionary tales. They're lessons in what not to do. They're reminders that losing has consequences beyond the scoreboard. It affects people. It shapes franchises. It creates legacies. The 9-73 Sixers are immortal because they were so bad. Every terrible team since has been compared to them. Their record has stood for over 50 years. It may never be broken. The 7-59 Bobcats have the worst winning percentage ever. That record is even harder to break because it would require losing at an even more catastrophic rate in an 82-game season. These teams live forever in the record books, in the arguments, in the debates about tanking, about rebuilding, about what it means to compete.
They teach us that basketball is more than winning. It's about culture, about character, about how you handle adversity. The worst teams revealed who had character and who didn't, who could survive losing and who couldn't. And they teach us that hope is fragile, that fans invest their emotions in teams, and when those teams betray that investment by losing so consistently, so thoroughly, something breaks. Some fans leave and never come back. Others stay, loyalty hardened into something unbreakable. The NBA is better now at preventing these disasters. Better salary cap rules, better revenue sharing, better draft systems, better oversight of ownership. The likelihood of another 9-73, another 7-59 is lower than ever. But it could still happen. A perfect storm of injuries, bad luck, poor management, and dysfunction could create another historically terrible team. And if it does, we'll remember these teams. We'll compare the new disaster to the old ones. We'll ask if they're worse than the Bobcats, worse than the Sixers, worse than anyone. Because these teams, as much as we wish to forget them, are part of basketball history. They matter. Their losses matter. Their struggles matter. They remind us that in basketball, as in life, sometimes you lose, and sometimes you keep losing. And the only question that matters is what you do next. Do you quit? Do you give up? Do you blame others?
Or do you show up the next night and try again, knowing you'll probably lose, but trying anyway because that's what it means to compete? The worst teams in NBA history answered that question differently. Some quit, some fought, some lost their way entirely, but they all left something behind. A record, a story, a lesson. And now, decades later, we remember them not for what they won, but for what they lost. The arena is empty now. The final buzzer has sounded. The worst teams in NBA history have played their last games, but their stories remain. Whispered in locker rooms, debated by fans, studied by analysts trying to understand how failure happens at such a grand scale. 9-73, 7-59, 11-71, 12-70, 0-18 to start a season. These aren't just numbers. They're tombstones, markers for seasons where hope died, where dreams collapsed, where losing became the only certainty.
Some players from those teams went on to better things. Others never escaped the shadow of those losses. Some coaches rebuilt their reputations. Others never coached again. The franchises themselves learned, or didn't. Some used the failure as foundation for future success.
Others repeated the same mistakes, trapped in cycles of dysfunction that seemed impossible to break. And the fans, the loyal ones who stayed through 70 losses, through historic embarrassment, through nights when the arena felt like a funeral, they carried those seasons with them. They know what rock bottom looks like. They've lived it. But here's what nobody tells you about the worst teams in NBA history. They proved something profound about basketball, about sports, about human nature. They proved that even in total failure, even in record-breaking loss, people still show up. Players still compete. Coaches still strategize. Fans still hope, even when hope seems foolish. The worst teams ever built weren't just basketball disasters. They were tests of resilience, of character, of how much losing a person can endure before they break or adapt or transcend. And in the darkness of those seasons, in arenas half empty and scoreboards showing impossible deficits, something important was revealed. The love of the game itself, separate from winning, separate from success.
Because if you can play on a 9-73 team and still love basketball, then you truly love basketball. If you can coach an 11-71 team and show up the next day with a game plan, then coaching is in your blood. If you can buy tickets to watch a 7-59 team play, then you're more than a fair-weather fan. The worst teams in NBA history showed us the floor, the absolute bottom, the place where losing becomes historically significant. But they also showed us that even at the bottom, basketball continues. The ball still bounces. The rim still stands 10 feet high. The game still matters. Some nights are darker than others. Some seasons are lost before they begin. Some teams are doomed from opening tip to final buzzer. But the game goes on. It always goes on. And somewhere, in an empty arena, in the quiet hours after another crushing defeat, a young player takes one more shot, practices one more move, believes, despite everything, that tomorrow might be different. It usually isn't. For the worst teams in history, tomorrow was just another loss.
But the belief, the hope, the willingness to try again, that's what survives when everything else is gone. That's the legacy of the worst NBA teams ever built. Not the losses, not the records, not the embarrassment, but the fact that they played, that they tried, that they existed, however briefly, however badly, in the history of a game that demanded more than they could give. And now, as you drift towards sleep, remember those teams. The players who showed up despite knowing they'd lose. The coaches who drew up plays that wouldn't work. The fans who cheered when there was nothing to cheer for. Remember that basketball, like life, isn't always about winning. Sometimes it's about showing up when you know you'll lose, and playing anyway, and trying anyway, and believing, even in the darkness, that tomorrow might bring something better. Even if it doesn't, even if tomorrow brings another loss, another defeat, another night in the record books, you still play. Because that's what basketball teaches us. You still play. Even now, in arenas across the country, in empty gymnasiums late at night, the echoes of those terrible seasons still linger. The memory of 9-73, the ghost of 7-59,